Joining us now as we continue our summer scouting series on the Picks Four Polls podcast. He was on here when the Bears drafted Justin Fields. It's been a while, but we're bringing him back. Dan Hope, Ohio State Buckeyes reporter for 11 Warriors, is back. You can follow him on X at Dan_Hope. Let's get into it, Dan. How's it going? How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am doing good. Okay, so this is, I think, the most intriguing Ohio State roster we've possibly seen in a while, because they are absolutely loaded with talent. Like, to me, there's at least one Ohio State guy that seems to be a first rounder every single year. But then you look at this year in terms of looking at the 2025 draft class, and it is, really kind of going to be a fun year to watch. But how'd 2023 end for Ohio State? What's the vibe in Columbus going into 2024, knowing that you've got some of these West Coast teams that are joining the Big Ten and there's all this new competition that's coming in?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of excitement about this team going into 2024 because of all the guys who decided to stay for another year. I mean, whether it's Travion Henderson, Emeka Egbuka, Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Denzel Burke, Lathan Ransom. I mean, these are all guys who could have been in the NFL draft last year that chose to come back for another year. And so you look at all that talent, and then you added some big pieces from a transfer portal like Caleb Downs, Quinshon Judkins. You have Jeremiah Smith, the number one overall recruit in the 2024 class, coming in. All the pieces are there on paper where this should be a team that can compete for a national championship. Now, I think there's also a lot of pressure on Ryan Day and this program because of the fact that Ohio State has lost to Michigan 3 years in a row. Ohio State has fallen short of its, three major goals, which are beating Michigan, winning the Big Ten, winning a national championship. Ohio State hasn't achieved any of those goals over the last 3 years. And so, there's a lot of pressure on this program going into this year to get back to achieving at least some of those goals, starting with winning that rivalry game against Michigan. But I think the expectations for this team are sky high based on the talent on this roster.
And again, the Big Ten's a conference that's kind of seen a lot of change just in the last few months alone. You have a new head coach at Michigan. You have a new offensive coordinator at Iowa. In Illinois, they appear to be building something. Penn State's going to be good as always. But in your opinion, what are the most intriguing games on the schedule outside of that Michigan game? Because that's obviously one of the most noteworthy matchups every single year for Ohio State that are on the schedule. Because, you have Oregon, you got Iowa, Penn State's on the slate, and then there's a couple, MAC teams on there to start the season. But it appears to be, I think, a very favorable schedule for the Buckeyes.
Yeah, I think the game that's circled for me is that Ohio State at Oregon game. That'll be the sixth game of the season for Ohio State. So it's right in that midpoint of a season, middle of October. And I think, that to me, I see that as a potential Big Ten championship game preview. I think with Oregon coming into the conference, I think Oregon is going to be Ohio State's top competition for a Big Ten title this year. They brought in a lot of talent through the transfer portal. They have a very well-rounded roster. And so I think that game, on October 12th, that's probably going to be the biggest test of the regular season for Ohio State, aside from that rivalry game at the end of the year. Certainly a road trip to Penn State is never easy too, but Ohio State has won, I believe, 9 straight games against Penn State now. I think Oregon, that road trip, that's going to really be the first, major test for this team. They do have, Michigan State and Iowa the 2 weeks leading up to that, but Ohio State's still going to be heavily favored in those two games. I think that Oregon game is going to be that first real big test for this Ohio State team of whether it's actually as good as it's being billed to be.
And speaking of being as good as it's built to be, is there a serious argument with the amount of talent? Because you talked about it earlier in terms of all these guys coming back. Is this probably one of the top rosters or the best roster that we've seen throughout the Ryan Day era? Because there are, 6 or 7 guys right now that I think are going to be top 64 picks. And that's based on, preseason projections sitting here toward the end of June.
Yeah, I think it probably is the best roster that Ryan Day has had at Ohio State. I think really the most comparable one would be 2019, his first year as head coach. That was a really loaded team of Justin Fields at quarterback, Chris Olave leading the receiving core, Chase Young leading the defense. That was a really well-rounded, complete team. I think that's been Ryan Day's best team through his 5 years as head coach, but I think this one certainly has the potential to be even better. There's still, there's two big question marks, I think, with this team. Number one being the quarterback, number two being the offensive line. I think those are the two areas that, those could make or break the season. I mean, I think the defense is certainly the most talented defense Ryan Day has had at Ohio State. It should be the best defense in the country. The skill position talent, I mean, you've got Travion Henderson and Quinshad Judkins. Those are two of the top 5 running backs in the country on the same team. The receiving core is loaded. A lot of it is going to boil down to how good is the quarterback play going to be, and can the offensive line take a big step from last season?
Yeah, and you talk about that quarterback not competition, I want to say, but it's certainly a position to go ahead and watch, because you got Kyle McCord, who was there last year, but then you also bring in Will Howard. What'd you see from both of those guys in the spring game that, kind of allowed you to see, okay, post CJ Stroud era, they're trying to go ahead and figure this out. Who do you think has the upper hand going into 2024?
Yeah, so Kyle McCord is now at Syracuse, but Will Howard is in from Kansas State. And so he's certainly the front runner to be that starter, but I don't think he did enough this spring to lock down that starting quarterback job. I was at several practices. I was at the spring game. The passing consistency was not there to where you feel really good going into preseason camp that he's the guy. Now, the good news is they have 5 scholarship quarterbacks on the roster. So they've got very rare depth at that position. You've got a guy in Devin Brown who is very highly recruited going into his 3rd year. He's got some talent. And then you've got, Julian Sayin, who was the number 1 ranked quarterback in the 2024 recruiting class. Now, he's a true freshman. He's a guy who still needs to put on some size. And so, it's probably not ideal to thrust him in this year, but they really like what they've seen from him, to where I don't think it's out of a question that he could come in and play a major role at some point this year. You think of guys like Trevor Lawrence and Tua Tagovailoa, where, by the end of the year, they emerged as the top quarterback for their teams. I don't think it's out of a question that Julian Sayin could have that kind of impact in year one. I think the job is Will Howard's to lose still right now. And I think the hope from Ohio State is that he will show improvement in preseason camp now that he's had a spring to, develop that timing and chemistry of his receivers, that he will become more polished as a passer in preseason camp. But I think if he doesn't, the door will be open to where, Ohio State could potentially go a different route at some point during the season.
And so that's going to be one to watch, but let's get into some of these more specific players here at certain position groups, because Marvin Harrison Jr. is gone. You now have Emeka Egbuka, who is, to me, wide receiver 1, simply because when you look at kind of last year and throughout the fall, there were people saying, well, there's a chance that Ohio State, does have 2 first-round wide receivers, once again, similar to what they had with Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. But is this Egbuka's wide receiver room now? I mean, what does he have to do to take that massive step forward and go from being, just another Ohio State wide receiver to kind of being that true wide receiver 1?
Yeah, I think he's certainly going to go into the year as that. He's certainly now the veteran leader of this room, with Marvin Harrison Jr. being gone. For him, really, last year, the problem was just he got hurt. He had a high ankle sprain early in the season, and he was just not the same player after that. Even when he came back, he was just not ever 100% by the end of the season, and we just didn't see him play up to his full potential. You look back at what he was as a sophomore, he very much was one of the best wide receivers in the country, probably a little bit overshadowed by Marvin Harrison Jr., but he was fantastic as a sophomore. I think, the injury last year, as well as some inconsistency at quarterback play compared to the year before, kept us from ever really seeing the full Emeka Egbuka last year. But I think if he can return to form and really assert himself as the leader of that room, he can absolutely be the next first round wide receiver from Ohio State. Now, he's not going to be the only guy in that room. He's probably the only 2025 NFL draft prospect in that room this year, but you've got, two very talented sophomores and Carnell Tate and Brandon Innes. And then again, Jeremiah Smith, he's a guy that his hype is just sky high right now. Is the number one overall prospect in his recruiting class. I don't think it's out of the question that Jeremiah becomes Ohio State's best receiver by the end of the year. I think he's that good. But Emeka's certainly going to start the year as that go-to guy, and I certainly expect that we're going to see Emeka have a great year.
Yeah, and it's going to be really fun to watch because it just seems like year after year, Ohio State does have those guys who kind of start, to propel themselves as going from, guys that the average fan, people like me who don't really get a ton of time to watch a lot of Ohio State games, but only focus on them because of the draft. You start by watching them, and then all of a sudden everyone's talking about those guys as in, another year or two being the top wide receiver prospect, which fun little fact here, for our listeners. I mean, if Egbuka gets drafted, then it would be the third straight year in round one that Ohio State's had a wide receiver go. But let's talk pass rushers here, because the Bears, even though they have Montez Sweat, again, us being a Bears podcast, we're always focused on pass rushers for whatever reason. I mean, Ohio State's got two really good ones. I like Jack Sawyer. I love JT Tolomolu. I mean, pretty good edge rushing duo there. Do you think both of those guys end up as first round picks? What is in store for both of them as they head into what's probably going to be their last season in Columbus?
I will note it would actually be the fourth year in a row that Ohio State would have a first round pick at wide receiver. It would be 5 in 4 years, which would be something because they had gone, I believe, 15 years before that without a first round wide receiver. So that really shows you what Brian Hartline has done in that Ohio State wide receiver room to really make it into an NFL factory at that position. But, going back to Sawyer and JT, I think they both have the potential certainly to be first round picks in 2025. I don't know that I would say right now that I, fully expect them both to be first round picks, but I think the potential is there. I think they're both guys who, they came in as top 5 overall recruits in their class. The expectations for them were sky high when they started at Ohio State. Everybody thought, oh, this is going to be the next Nick Bosa and Chase Young. And they started off a little bit slower than those guys did. But, we've seen when both of those guys are at their best, that they can absolutely play at that first round level. I mean, we've seen, you go back 2 years ago to the game against Penn State where JT just had probably one of the best games a college football defensive player has ever had. He can absolutely take over a game when he's at his best. You look at what Jack Sawyer did the last 3 games of last year. If he can play at that level all year, he will be a first round pick. The way that he played down the stretch of last season. We just haven't seen either of those guys yet get to that point where they consistently dominate games to where you can say they're surefire first round picks, but both of them have that kind of ability. I think, it's just a matter of, now being 4th year guys at Ohio State. Can they put it all together? I think right now, personally, I think that Jack is a little bit further ahead of JT as just an all-around football player, but I wouldn't be surprised to see either one of those guys become an all-American caliber player and or a first-round pick this year.
I mean, that's going to be a duel that's on my watch list as well, but sticking with the defensive line, Tyleik Williams is a player to me that is drawing a lot of praise for what he's done going back to last season, but also, what his ceiling is going to be. And this is, I should note, a loaded defensive line class. When you look at some of the Michigan guys, the couple of the players from Kentucky, Notre Dame, but is there a legit argument to be made that of the players that Ohio State's likely sending to the next level in the upcoming spring, that Tyleik Williams has the highest ceiling of them all? Because I was watching some tape last week, and I think, there's arm length, there's burst there's quickness, there's awareness. He just seems to me like he's the complete package at that defensive tackle position. Yeah,
there's definitely an argument there. I mean, he was a guy, going into last year, Jack and JT really were the two guys getting all the attention on that defensive line. And for most of the year, Tyleik was the best defensive lineman. He was the most consistently productive guy on that defensive line. And I mean, he played a ton of snaps last year, and you're talking about a guy who's 325 pounds. So for him to be able to handle the workload that he took last year, where he was almost never leaving the field. He had over 50 tackles, which you don't usually see from a defensive tackle. For him to be able to play as much as he did and play at such a consistently high level at his size, that's very impressive. You don't often see that from a guy of his size, to be able to sustain that level of play that he did throughout last year on a consistent basis. And certainly the athleticism that he has for his size is very impressive. And so I do think that, we saw last year, his first couple years at Ohio State, it was kind of like, he'd flash, he'd have a really good game, but then the next game you might not see much from him. Last year was when we really started to see him become that consistent impact player on Ohio State's defensive line. And I think if he can continue that again this year, he's certainly a guy who is going to be well within that first round conversation.
Yeah, and I would even go so far as to argue that you look at, this group of defensive tackles that's projected to declare for next year. I mean, I do think Williams is going to be a top 10 pick, most likely just based on his raw athletic abilities alone. Again, we're not even going to get into some of his production, which I think we all know is going to be really good. But beyond some of these guys on defense and sticking with, the defense, you talked about some of the running backs already. Ohio State has, I think, two really solid corners in Denzel Burke and Davison Igbinosun. They, to me, appeared to be somewhat inconsistent last year. But what do those two guys have to do to go ahead and bounce back and really vault up the draft boards? Because right now, I mean, a lot of people are saying that they are in store for a pretty big season and that there's a chance that, both of those guys end up being really high picks.
Yeah, I mean, I would personally disagree with the inconsistent characterization when we're talking about Denzel Burke. I mean, I think Denzel Burke was one of the best corners in college football last year. He was pretty dominant. If you look at Ohio State's pass defense, they were the number one pass defense in the country, and I don't think anybody played a bigger role in that than Denzel Burke. He was a guy who was consistently going against the opponent's best receiver and in most cases shutting them down. And so I think Denzel Burke, in my mind, my opinion, I think Denzel Burke is Ohio State's top 20-25 NFL draft prospect. I think he's should be a solid first round pick. I know it's a really strong corner class, so there's a lot of guys who are going to be in that conversation. But in my mind, Denzel Burke should, for sure be a first round pick if he plays the same way he did this year as he did last year. I mean, this is a guy who's already been a starter for 3 years. So he has a ton of experience, a ton of body of work. I think he's a guy who should be an All-American candidate this year and should be a guy who can go into the NFL and be an immediate starter at cornerback. I think Davison Igbinosun definitely was a little bit more up and down last season, but he's a guy that I think, the big thing I'd say about Davison is I think he's an excellent run stopping corner. He's a guy who is very physical. He has great size. He will, absolutely, come downhill and get active in the run game. So I think that's something you love seeing from him. I think he was a little bit more up and down in pass coverage, but again, Ohio State led the country in passing yards allowed per game. Like, you don't do that unless all of your starting DBs are playing at a high level. And so, he's a guy that I think his technique can get a little bit sloppy at times. I think he's a little bit overly prone to penalties in terms of, grabbing guys when, someone does get a step on him. But he's a very competitive player. He's very physical. He's a guy, both those guys are guys who play with a ton of confidence out there, which is so important at that cornerback position. And I think if he can, you look at where he was as a freshman at Ole Miss and you look at where he was last year. I think if he can continue on the trajectory he's on, he's a guy who certainly has the potential to also be one of the best cornerbacks in the country this year and become an early round pick in the 2025 draft. And I wouldn't sleep on Jordan Hancock either. I think he's a guy at that nickel corner position who's a really good slot corner, a guy who I think plays bigger than he is in terms of his ability to, come down and be a factor in the run game, be a sound tackler. And he's also really good at covering slot receivers. So I think Ohio State has 3 guys at that cornerback position, in the hypothetical assumption that Davison Igbinosun chooses to enter the draft next year. There's a very good chance Ohio State will have 3 cornerbacks drafted a year from now.
I mean, that's certainly going to be a position to watch. So to me, with the way that defenses are going in the league, having a hybrid safety / linebacker, is so intriguing. Again, some teams will call them dogs. Some people say like Jack or Joker, but Sonny Styles being 19, 20 years old is interesting because I know that some people say that he is a linebacker, but at the next level, some teams might even consider him a safety or just that hybrid between, both of them. What is his role in this defense? Because the position that he gets graded out is certainly going to be one that scouts have a discussion on, and teams do as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's going to be a linebacker for Ohio State this year, and I think that's probably what he's going to be primarily at the next level. I mean, you look at just how he's grown physically. I mean, he's a guy who's 235 pounds now, and I think, watching him last year, there were times where I think playing, he started the year playing nickel, which is really impressive for a guy his size, but there were certainly times where he looked a little bit overmatched when, he's getting matched up against a slot receiver at his size. That's a tough cover for a guy of his size. I think he has the athleticism and the coverage ability where he can play strong safety. We saw him play that, in the second half of last season after Lathan Ransom got hurt. But I think when you're projecting, his long-term career potential, where he's going to have the best career, I think it's as that, will linebacker kind of player, because, as you said, the way the game has evolved now, that coverage ability is so important at linebacker now. I mean, you're not necessarily looking for the Dick Butkus type who's just a big, massive run stopper. You're looking for those guys who can drop into coverage and play on 3 downs and match up with slot receivers, really athletic tight ends, running backs out of a backfield, you name it. I think that's where Sonny's potential is so high, is that he's a guy who has that defensive background. He can cover like a defensive back, but he's also big and strong and physical enough where, he can hold up between the tackles as a run stopper, a very effective blitzer. And so his role is still kind of being determined on this Ohio State defense this year, because he is making that position change from safety to linebacker. He's competing with another 5-star recruit and CJ Hicks to be that starting will linebacker. And I personally think, if I look at what's going to be best for Sonny long-term, I think he's probably a guy who should be looking right now at staying at Ohio State for 2 more years, playing out that senior year, because like you mentioned, he's a guy who's a year younger. He should actually be a sophomore in college right now because he reclassified a year up. And so he's a guy who I think probably right now would benefit from 2 more years at Ohio State, where, this year he can really kind of get his feet wet and get comfortable at linebacker. And then next year, when a lot of these other guys we're talking about are in the NFL, he can really become a star of that defense. But, the tools he has, he's certainly going to be getting looks from NFL teams this year as a possible guy who could be in the draft a year from now.
Absolutely. And I got 2 more for you here, but everyone wants to kind of focus on a lot of the big names. You look at what Ohio State has kind of sent to the league over the last couple of years. You look at what they're going to be sending, but then there's also, I think, a lot of guys that this past season, 2023, played the role of just, merely being depth guys, but still got enough looks to warrant being on people's watch list. I look at that linebacker room, I look at that defensive tackle room, but how about Cody Simon as well as Ty Hamilton? I mean, big things in store for those guys, I'd assume, going into 2024, because they, I think, finally will have a chance to really land on teams' radars as guys that could potentially be, top 100 picks as well.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think those are 2 guys to watch, whether it be, day free prospects or whatnot. I mean, I think last year, the last, 4, 5, 6 games of a season, I think Cody Simon was Ohio State's best linebacker. He wasn't a full-time starter, but I think he's a guy that was playing at a really high level down the stretch of last season, was doing a really good job. I think particularly against the run, I think he's, a really good run stopper between the tackles, a guy who I think maybe there'll be some questions just about, how athletic is he? Is he a guy that, can be that free down linebacker in the NFL? Does he have quite enough quickness, sideline to sideline range? I think that's kind of to be seen this year. And I think that will kind of determine, as he becomes that full-time player, how well does he do in the coverage aspect of the game? I think that's going to ultimately determine whether he's a guy who, can become that middle round draft prospect or whether he's, kind of that late round fringe guy. I think, it's going to depend really on, whether he can take that next step this year. But I think the way he played down the stretch of last season, you saw the upside there to where Cody Simon can be a really good player. And then, Ty Hamilton is a guy who I think is definitely a, quietly very impactful player on this defensive line. Maybe not as flashy as a Tyleik or a Jack Sawyer or a JT Tuimoloau, but he's a good run stopper. Another guy kind of like Jack, where at the end of last season, you started to see him put it all together and become more disruptive. And I think the thing that's kind of interesting about Ty is you look at his older brother, Devon Hamilton, who plays for the Jacksonville Jaguars. He kind of had a similar trajectory to what Ty's career has been like, where his first few years, he didn't play a ton, just kind of quietly kind of started to get into the rotation and make some plays here and there. And then, fourth year, you started to see him, become, more impactful, but still not a guy who was really getting a lot of attention on that Ohio State defensive line. And then his fifth year, he really took a big step and became a more consistent difference maker and ends up becoming a third-round draft pick. I think it's very possible that Ty could have that same kind of trajectory, so where he could have that breakout fifth-year senior season and end up making himself at that middle round draft pick. I mean, but the tough thing is for both of those guys is there's so many playmakers on this defense that it's like, I think the stats for some of these guys maybe won't jump off the page at the end of the year just because there's so many guys on that defense that are going to be making plays. But I think Ty's a guy, I know that Ohio State's really high on him. And I think he's a guy that, if he can continue to build off of what he did last year, there will be a lot to like for NFL scouts there.
Absolutely. Last one from me here, but earlier you mentioned the word bounce back when referring to the offensive line. I mean, what does this O-line have to do in order to really bounce back and kind of just take this offense to another level? Because that's ultimately where the foundation of everything is on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, I mean, it was just way too up and down last year for that unit. There were too many lapses in pass protection, and they never got to the point where they were consistently moving people in the run game. And so I think, really, across the board, it's a unit that just needs to be better. And the pieces are there. I mean, Donovan Jackson is one of the most talented guards in the country. If he can put it all together this year, he's certainly a guy that is going to be talked about as one of the top guards in the 2025 NFL draft class. Josh Simmons at left tackle is a guy who has a ton of physical ability. We saw some issues last year with, technical lapses, with penalties, but he did quietly improve over the course of a year. So I think he's another guy who's going to be on NFL scouts' radar. If he can put it all together this year, he's a guy who certainly has NFL potential. Josh Fryer's a guy at right tackle who I think was a really good run blocker last year, but the pass pro, particularly against the speed rush, he had some trouble just dealing with fast guys off the edge. So, there's been talk this offseason that he's improved his body. He's gotten quicker. I think that's something that's going to need to come to fruition on that right side of the offensive line for this offensive line to take a significant step forward. Right guard is really the big question mark position right now. They don't really know yet who's going to be that starter there. And so they need to find a guy there. And then Seth McLaughlin's a guy who did some good things at Alabama, but, as a lot of people know, had a really rough game in the Rose Bowl where had some costly snaps that, led to Alabama's loss against Michigan. And so I know that, Ohio State has said this spring that his snaps were not an issue. So they're hopeful that will just be, a fluke kind of thing, and he'll be able to overcome that this year. But that'll be a bit of a question mark as well. And so, I think they have enough talent to where they should be able to take a step forward. But I still look at that offensive line. If you're looking for, a potential flaw on this team that keeps it from achieving its goals, you start with that front five.
So it's going to be an interesting year to watch. Where can people kind of follow you, keep up with your work, and just stay updated on all things Ohio State as we get closer to the start of the season?
Yeah, you can visit us at 11warriors.com. You can see the logo behind me. That's how it's spelled. So 11warriors.com. We cover all things Ohio State sports, especially football. We've got fresh content every single day. So, if you want to keep up with, all things Ohio State football and other Ohio State sports during this 2024 season, check us out over at 11warriors.com.
And where can people follow you on social media, Dan?
Yeah, I am on X at Dan_Hope.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for hopping on, and it'd be interesting to see how the season plays out for the Buckeyes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.